Hi again. So welcome to M+. Just thank you all for being here on the Friday night. My name is Neil Zhang. I'm currently serving as a Dean Associate Curator of Visual Arts. And tonight we're gathered here to be part of this talk. And this program introduced the this program introduced the M+HK Fellowship for Chinese Contemporary, which supports a new research on Chinese visual culture through access to the M+ collection, library, and working with the curatorial team here. And each year, a fellow joins us to explore the topic of their choice and contribute to the wider field. And tonight, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Huang Mei from Barcelona, Spain, joining us tonight. Welcome. And Dr. Huang Mei is a current SIG Fellow whose work reflects the spirit of the fellowship, curiosity, critical thinking, and the fresh perspectives on the Chinese contemporary art. We're also very pleased to have the members of the SIG Fellowship jury joining us tonight. Dr. Iftihar Dadi, John H. Breeze Professor in the History of Art at Cornell University. Welcome. And Dr. Wu Mo, SIG Curator here at M+. Also joining us online, Russell. Hi, Russell. So yes, Russell joining us online. Russell is the Senior Curator and Associate Director of the Curatorial Affairs. And also a quick note before we begin. So tonight's talk will be conducted in English and with real-time Cantonese and Mandarin interpretation available. So in the end of the talk, so please, feel free to ask your question in Mandarin or Cantonese. There will be a translator to interpret your question into English. And again, thank you for being here tonight, and please enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'd like to thank the viewers for taking the time to engage with this project. First, I would like to thank M+ for giving me this opportunity to present this research here. I'm also very grateful for the support of SIG Fellowship for Chinese Art Research. Without this support, this project would not have been possible. This project is called The Places We Didn't Look From. It looks at site-specific art made by ethnic minority artists in Tibet and Inner Mongolia during 1990s and 2000s. This is not a project I did alone. It built on the work, ideas, and the generosity of many artists. Their practices are really the heart of this research. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Inner Mongolia artist Shintana, who traveled a long way to be here. Her presence really means a lot to me and also means a lot to this project. In next few minutes, I will briefly introduce the background of this research, share the main questions I'm asking, and talk about how these artworks invite us to think differently about the place, visibility, and ethnic minority art within contemporary Chinese art history. So, this project starts with three very simple questions. The first one is this. What if the story of contemporary Chinese art has mostly been told from just one angle? For a long time, we have been looking at the same artists, the same cities, and the same institutions. Very often, they are centered around the major metropolitan areas. The second question is, what if those centers are not the only centers? What happens if we look away from Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or Hong Kong, or from international exhibition circles, and instead look at the places like Tibet and Inner Mongolia, places that often described as marginal. And the third question is the simplest, but maybe the most important one. What if the story changes the moment we change where we look from? Not just what we look at, but where we look. Taken together, these questions ask to us rethink where as artistic meaning is produced, whose perspectives are made visible, and whose have differently disappeared from the story. Here, as you can see, this project can be outlined through 5 key points. First, I focused on 2 overlooked site-specific trajectories. Instead of treating ethnic minority art as a single category, I look at 2 different yet connected trajectories, one in Tibet and one in Inner Mongolia, that emerged during the 1990s and 2000s. Second, this research is grounded in the fieldwork and archive research. It joins on-site visits, artist interviews, and the study of exhibition records and local archives. Third, in these practices, land and space are not just backdrops. Site functions as an active agent, tied landscape, ecology, and questions of identity. Fourth, rather than fixing artists by ethnicity, I trace exchange and collaboration across ethnic boundaries. And finally, this project looks beyond China's cultural centers. It shifts attention away from dominant urban institutions and foregrounds alternative sites of artistic production. Together, this point forms the foundation of the study and lead into the case studies that follow. This research responds to a clear gap in how contemporary Chinese art has been written. Instead of tracing Tibet and Inner Mongolia as marginal, I take them as a primary site of inquiry. By focusing on overlooked site-specific practices, the project moves beyond artistic, ethnic, or folkloric readings. In this way, it shifts attention away from center-based narratives and opens up a more relational understanding of contemporary art. Before moving into the case studies, I'd like to briefly introduce a timeline of this research. This timeline maps key site-specific practices in Inner Mongolia and Tibet from late 1980s to after 2009. It is not meant to show a single linear development. Instead, it highlights parallel trajectories unfolding at different themes and shaped by local conditions. What matters here is not only when these works were made, but how artists in the 2 regions responded, sometimes differently, sometimes relationally, to question of land, identity, visibility over time. This timeline gives us a structure before we look more closely at individual works. Now we look at this slide. From 1990s to 1995, we began to see clear awareness of site emerging to both Inner Mongolia and Tibet. At this stage, site is not yet a fully articulated concept, but artists are no longer treating it as a neutral backdrop. In Inner Mongolia, works like Winter and Maintaining the Pregnancy shows artists engaging with broader contemporary discourses through different media. In Tibet, Bound Up the Scenery reflects an early sensitivity to landscape, the body, and the visibility. Together, these practices mark the initial foundation of the site awareness, which would later become explicit. And here, from 1995 to 2000, site-based strategies become more clearly articulated, though they develop differently in Inner Mongolia and Tibet. In Inner Mongolia, as we can see, works like Red, Yellow, and Blue and the Saddle Horses series shows artists pushing beyond the ethnic general painting through abstraction, symbolism, and material experimentation. In Tibet, Capers of Waters Lhasa marks a parallel trajectory where ecological concern and the local spartical knowledge become central to artistic practices. During this period, site is no longer a neutral backdrop, but a culture and a political space shaping artistic meaning. As we can see here, from 2000 to 2005, we see a clear phase of conceptual expansion. In Inner Mongolia, works such as Reflection, Miniature Long March, and Divination shows artists engaging more directly with history, temporality, and symbolic action within specific sites. And in Tibet, the founding of the Gundun Chunpei Collective in 2003 marks a shift towards collective practice and shared critical inquiry. At this point, site specificity is no longer only about location, but about historical memory and collection positioning. Here, from 2000 onward, site-specific practice increasingly turned towards narrative and dialogue as a key artistic strategies. In Inner Mongolia, the Golden Fairytale series uses storytelling to reflect on land, displacement, and imagination of place. In Tibet, the dialogue series foreground exchange between artists, sites, and audiences, while also operating as a metaphorical level. During this period, site becomes a space for narration and encounter, rather than a fixed location. Finally, beyond 2009, the impact of these practices continues. In Inner Mongolia, we see their influences on younger generations of artists and ongoing site-based exploration. In Tibet, they contribute to continued debates around contemporary Tibetan art within a broader art history narratives. Rather than a conclusion, this period points a continuity and transformation. At this point, we move into the Tibet timeline map. Rather than isolated events, this map shows site-based practice developing through connections, extensions, and collective formation. It begins with bound-up scenery in the late 1980s and continues with Capers of Waters Lhasa in the mid-1990s, where ecology and the local spatial knowledge become central. In the early 2000s, these trajectories converge into the formation of Gundun Chunpei Collective in Lhasa. This movement, shaped not only by local conditions, but also by globalization, international capital, and the boom of Chinese contemporary art. At the same time, site extension, including Tibetan artist communities outside of Tibet Autonomous Region in China, complicate the fixed territorial ideas of site. This map points towards influence rather than closure, shows site as a relational and continuity redefined. Having traced the development of site-based practice in Tibet, now we move to Inner Mongolia. Unlike a linear timeline, this map presents Inner Mongolia as an open and decentered artistic ecology. It shows how site-based practices emerged through multiple shifts and the pressure over time, rather than along a single trajectory. As we can see here, in the 1990s, many practices developed outside of official frameworks through non-institutional models where tradition and non-tradition forms coexisted. In the early 2000s, we see a shift from the grand historical narratives towards personal memory and the lived experiences. At the same time, glassland becomes more than an image or motif. It functions as a way of saying, an epistemic position. Parallel to this, artists increasingly negotiate identity and social definition, moving between self-definition and externally imposed categories. By the late 2000s and beyond, this practice is facing growing folklorization pressure, shaped by market and trend-driven expectations. Together, this nodes forms an interconnected ecology where sight is continuously produced through practice, perception, memory, and negotiation. This map sets the stage for Inner Mongolia case studies that follow. Here, as we can see, this section introduced the first study case from Tibet in the 1990s. It looks at early site-based practices and how artists engage with landscape, ecology, and emerging forms of collective action. These early works lay the groundwork for the development we see later. Bound Up Scenery was created in the 1987 by Nozi and Liu Zhuoquan. At the moment, two artists were working very closely together in Tibet. Their collaboration was not based in an art institution. At the time, they were both working at Tibet television. This meant that their collaboration grew out of the shared everyday working environment, a lived context, rather than a formally defined artistic framework. In this work, white fabric is placed directly onto the landscape at the Bangong Lake, while the artist's bodies are particularly swapped in red clothes. Rather than producing an object, this action briefly inscribed the human presence into the site. Emerging from the shared label and the local experiences, this work is often considered one of the earliest site-based practices in Tibet. It also, very importantly, marks an early moment of everyday Han-Tibetan collaboration. What we can see here is Gada's This Shore, the Other Shore from 1996. The grabments are printed with Tibetan script from the Green Tala Herd Sutra and installed directly along the river bank. In this way, the site becomes a both physical place and a symbolic threshold. The realization of this work depended heavily on the local knowledge and the ritual familiarity. It was made possible through the active involvement of Tibetan artists and participants on site. The artist wearing the cap is Tengwang Tashi. His own work, Life Release, documents the Buddhist practice of releasing animals as an ethnic and spiritual act. Alongside him, several Tibetan artists play a key roles in preparing and coordinating these site-based events. However, informal media, archives, and institutional records Their artistic identities are often marginalized, appearing mainly as assistants rather than authors. This tension becomes even clear when we consider what was left after the event. While filmed as an act of care for protection, this work produced material residue and that requires to later clean up, raising questions of authorship, responsibility, and uneven consequences on the ground. In Tibet, site-specific art was shaped not only by place, but also by what was left behind, both materially and historically. So after looking at site-specific practices in Tibet, where local participation was essential but often marginalized, now I turn into Inner Mongolia in the 1990s. Here, what we see a different but related trajectory. In this case, ethnic minority artists themselves actively negotiate the site, material, and authorship within the region. Many worked outside official frameworks while deliberately resisting folklorized expectations. As we can see here in these images, although these works do not take place in an outdoor site, there are still closely tied site-related conditions. Winter, for example, from 1990s by Xie Jiande, and the Saddle of Horse series from 1998 by Asbagana, respond to the visual and institutional frameworks that shape artistic production in Inner Mongolia in the 1990s. At the time, minority art was often confined with folklorized genres. Rather than dissipating the place directly, these works engaged with the site as a condition of representation, questioning what could be seen, painted, and recognized as ethnic art. Here, site is articulated not through location, but through artistic strategy. Maintaining the pregnancy by either, as we can see here, was created around the turn of 1990s in the aftermath of the event surrounding the 1989 exhibition closures. At the time, Eder described himself as a relatively marginal artist working in Inner Mongolia, yet closely attentive to the fate of contemporary art. The work emerged from a simple but urgent question: whether the fragile impulse of Chinese contemporary art could be somehow kept alive at the time. The idea of pregnancy functions as a metaphor, not biological, but cultural and spiritual, for sustaining a still unformed contemporary art practice. The installation brings together multiple symbolic elements: a television used as a screen for X-ray image, heartbeat songs, infusion devices, and red liquid slow fade into the glass container holding an egg yolk. He later reflected that the work may contain too many elements at the time. Its language perhaps overly explicit, yet precisely through this exercise, the work captures an anxious moment of uncertainty, an attempt by one individual artist to preserve the split of contemporary art at the time when its future felt deeply precautious. So what begins in the 1990s? It is a quite interesting question. In the 1990s, Chinese art scholars and critics such as Wu Honglenling and others articulated a shared concern. In the works such as Xme At the moment when Chinese art was often interpreted through Western framework of Chineseness, a crucial question was raised: who is the subject speaking and who is being spoken for? This question, who am I and who gets to define me, become the center to Chinese contemporary art discourse in the 1990s. Importantly, this line of thinking did not remain confined to Han Chinese contemporary art. It also shaped the emergence of minority contemporary art practices. Here, ethnic identity functioned not as a folkloric representation, but as a model of artistic self-definition within the same intellectual and artistic currents. In this sense, minority contemporary art and Chinese contemporary art were mutually constitutive, rather than existing as a separate or isolated trajectories. So, having looked at how site-based practice emerged from 1990s through questions of identity, institution, and authorship, now I'd like to turn to Tibet in 2000s as a comparative case. This shift allows us to see how site-specific art moves from early experimental gestures towards a more self-conscious and articulated engagement with place. In the Tibet context of the 2000s, site is no longer just a backdrop or symbol. It becomes an active field, shaped by ecology, time, collaboration, and negotiation. At this moment, site-specific practice in Tibet takes a decisive turn with the emergence of the artist-run space. Founded in Lhasa in 2003, the Gundun Chunpei Collective was the first artist-run space initiated by Tibetan artists themselves. Importantly, this was not only a new exhibition venue, it marks a redefinition of site, where production, discussion, and everyday life become inseparable. By operating outside of the official institutions, an embodiment of artistic actions in ordinary urban settings, street, neighborhood, and the social encounters, the collective transformed the artist-run space itself into a site-specific practice. Here, locality was produced through self-organization rather than representation. As the Buddha from 2006 by Gade is a time-based site-specific work installed in Lhasa River, facing the Potala Palace. Carved from ice, the Buddha slowly melts over time. Impermanence here is not a metaphor, but a physical process embodied in the site. The work often read through environmental discourses, but it also resonates with the broader concerns about Tibetan culture dissolving within globalization. Crucially, meaning is produced through the interaction of material, location, and duration. The river, the guarded urban landscape, and the act of disappearances. Rather than represent Tibet, the work allows itself to perform its temporal and cultural tension. Here, as we can see, Dialogue Series 1 from 2009 marks a clear shift from physical entanglement to relational distances. Created by Nozi and Liu Zhequan more than 20 years after Bound Up Stationery, this second collaboration reflects a transformed relationship between two artists. They remain in dialogue, but now are separated, cross water, landscape, constructed space, unable to physically cross towards one another. Starting from artistic friendship, the works move beyond the personal to address the shifting and often fraught nature-Han-Tibetan relationships. Here, site is no longer a shared ground. It becomes a condition of separation where landscape and spatial arrangement actively structure dialogue, distance, and asymmetry. As we can see from this work, Kuang Laowu belongs to a generation of Tibetan artists who did not grow fully learning Tibetan language. He was born in Aba, Sichuan, a Tibetan region outside of Tibet itself in China. Much of his education took place in Han language schools. Tibetan language was not something neutrally passed down. It was gradually lost. On the writing six-syllable mantra, language returned through the body. He writes the mantra directly onto his own skin while standing on Tibetan land. Here, language is not inherited through education, it's a reactive through action and place. The site here is not a symbolic homeland. It becomes a physical ground where language, belonging, and culture continuity are briefly reconnected. Now we move to Inner Mongolia. This site looks at Inner Mongolia site-specific practice in the 2000s. This work emerged from rapid urban change, not from exhibition spaces. The work showing here, Golden Fairy Tale Thinker, is by either. It takes place at the ordinary city intersection. The artist's body appears from a manhole, briefly interrupting the flow of everyday urban life. The figure is partially visible, caught between the underground and the city surface. This in-between position reflects how subjectivity is shaped by modernization, reallocation, and social reconstructioning. Here, site is not just a location, it is a social condition where presence, constraint, and belonging are negotiated. Through modest and temporary gesture, these works respond to urban experiences without relying overt symbolism. Reflection here, as we can see, is from 2000, where was photographed in both Beijing and Huahot. These are two cities where either has long lived and worked. Neither city is treated as a stable center for him. Instead, artist places himself at the margins of both. Using a small mirror, he reflects the fragments of surroundings of the city. He tries to see the world through the eyes of others. Everyday urban space becomes a site of self-observation. Here, site is not just geographical, it's experimental, shaped by movements, reflection, and an unstable sense of belonging. And this work, the speaker-narrator, either reflects an opposition of speaking that is present but not fully stable. The space itself, slogans appear in more than one language. Language becomes a part of the spatial environment, but does not always take the form of voice. Here, the meaning is sensed through the posture, space, staging, rather than spoken directly. Divination from 2002 marks a turning point of Boehringer's practice. He was originally trained as an exam preparation teacher, and later he entered the Beijing art science. Encountered with contemporary art led him to rethink direction, cultural references, and artistic positioning. In this work, divination is staged in the open landscape, and it suggests a search of orientation rather than prediction. Identity here is not fixed. It remains open and negotiated. This work by Qingga is a part of M+HK collection. The work is titled Miniature Long March. Here, movement is not a literal journey. It becomes an artistic method. By drawing a map directly on his body, Qingga links a physical presence with memory and history. Sight here is not a single place. It's produced through movement, embodiment, and a repeated encounter with the space. So here we move to the theoretical framework. This project is informed by 3 intersecting frameworks. First, identity, agency, and the performative help us to see how artists position themselves through embodied actions and specific places. Second, approaches to the post-colonial thinking and ethnic representation help us to understand how minority identities are articulated within the dominant cultural structures. And third, cultural representation frameworks allow us to read the site-based practices not just as artistic gestures, but as a way of negotiating visibility and voice. Together, these frameworks help us to understand site as a relational process shaped by movement, encounter, and lived experiences. Building on Stuart Hall's argument in cultural identity and diaspora, that identity is not fixed but produced through history, representation, and negotiation, I proposed an identity, agency, performative framework to read minority contemporary art in Tibet and Inner Mongolia. This framework understands artistic agency as operating through 4 overlapping presence. Hey? Sorry, I don't know what is going on here. Let's coming back to where it's supposed to be. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. Okay, now we are back. Okay, so let's continue. Presence, Tibetan, Mongolian, intertwined. I hope my pronunciation of French makes sense. Hopefully, refers to everyday life words, memory, belief, and particular artistics active as a living resources rather than as a static tradition. And presence, English, Mongolia, points to longer historical imperial encounter and the regional entanglement, as well as global interpretive frameworks through which minority cultures become legible. Presence, Chinois, highlights the role of PRC institutions, education systems, and exhibition structures that both constrain enabled artistic agency. Presence internationally describe the artist negotiation within global contemporary art, where local specificity is translated, resisted, and structurally recorded. Taken together, this presence shows how identity functions as a practice performed across local, regional, national, international sculptors, rather than just a single stable position. What I want to emphasize in this research is how minority art is often misrecognized through a process of folklorization. Minority art is frequently read through visible ethnic signs and stylistic makers. but instead it should be understood through artistic as epistemic subjects, as individuals whose practice emerge from lived experience, mobility, and situated knowledge. Here, folklorization functions as a regime of recognition. It makes ethnicity legible by translating it into repeatable and performative forms, where ethnicity becomes trend-driven or artistically consumable. Artists' practice are often oscillate between the lived experiences and the identity performance. This produces a tension between what is experienced and what is expected to be seen. In this context, for example, nomadic mobile discourses that rely heavily on ethnic legibility risk reproducing folkloric structures, even when formed as contemporary or critical. The issue, therefore, is not visibility itself, but condition under which visibility is produced. For this research, I developed my own methodological framework to address questions that existing approaches would not fully capture. This methodology you can see here is not linear, is interactive and relational. It begins with questions which are continuously refined through theory in defined gaps and emerging findings. At the center of the process, there are three interconnected methods: close analysis of artworks, in-depth artist interviews, and interactive coding and memo writing. These elements informs one another, allowing interpretation to evolve alongside the material. And in tracing cross-regional influence, this research also applies primarily on artist interviews. Across these conversations, artists repeatedly referred specific artistic references, formative expressions, and moments to encounter that shaped their early practices. Notably, many of these references corresponded to the work that now hold in the M+HK collection. This reflects a historical moment defined by artists themselves rather than a curatorial framework imposed by this research. Here, the collection functions as an archival convergence. I approach these influences as a lived and articulated experiences, and now turn into 5 recruiting dimensions through which site-based practices negotiate influence and locality. Site and identity, social cultural reflection, material strategies, audience engagement, and the balance of nationalization, globalization, and locality, as you can see here. Looking beyond the 2009, both Inner Mongolia and Tibet reveal new trajectories shaped by generation change, expanded mobility, and evolving artistic ecosystems. In Inner Mongolia, a new generation of ethnic minority artists has emerged, including figures such as Shintana. Their practices shows greater maturity and conceptual confidence. This shift shaped by the wider access to global avant-garde Chinese contemporary art, enabled by travel, for example, education, and digital circulation. despite largely conservative and institutional-oriented local art environment. These younger artists are now gradually gathering recognition from both Chinese and international art institutions while continuing negotiate the local conditions. In Tibet, a newer generation builds upon the earlier site-based collective practices. Some artists, such as Benba, we can see here, from beyond established Buddhist iconography and join instead from rural life and everyday experiences to develop distinct artistic languages. At the same time, the new creative ecosystems are forming. Independent spaces such as Bochun Art Space provide platforms for experimentation, dialogue, and community building. In parallel, a growing number of overseas trained and highly educated Tibetan artists are returning with expanded artistic vocabularies. And as many of these practices are still in formation, how these trajectories will unfold remains open and can only see or be fully understood over the time. What I would like to foreground here are contributions that are less visible, but structurally significant to minority contemporary art. So based on the interviews and the long-term research, it became clear that artistic development in Inner Mongolia and Tibet has depended not only by artists, but also on individuals and small initiatives working persistently behind the scenes to push the local cultural ecosystems. In Inner Mongolia, artist Wurgen, for example, as you can see, has continuously supported and curated non-profit free set-based exhibitions. And this project create rare platforms for younger Inner Mongolia and Han artists to experiment and collaborate outside of the institutional frameworks. The poster shows here documents some of the exhibition he curated. And in parallel, initiatives such as Nomad Relays, co-founded by 4 Inner Mongolia artists and scholars, have fostered cultural exchange and supported contemporary art practices in Beijing through substantive, locally grounded engagement. Similar forms of the support can be seen in project initiated by Luxi Korolu, whose exhibition, Transcendent Territories, facilitated cross-regional dialogue, and Li Xianting, whose curatorial efforts, such as the Scouting Son of Tibet, helped to create conditions for Tibetan contemporary art to develop and circulate in Beijing. International galleries such as Rosie also played a substantive role in supporting Tibetan contemporary artists, particularly by providing long-term visibility and institutional continuity beyond the local context. So these contributes are not often foreground in the dominant art historical narratives, but they are crucial to understand how minority contemporary art sense has been continuously formed and substanded. So to conclude, this research shows that contemporary art in Tibet and Inner Mongolia did not develop in isolation. It emerged through ongoing negotiation with the space, history, and shifting artistic currents from the Chinese Central Plains and the wider world. Since 1990s, minority artists in both regions has used site-specific practice to explore identity and assert agency within changing political, economic, and institutional conditions. In these works, locality is not a background, it becomes a method, one that reaffirms cultural memory, questions dominant narratives, and produces narrative forms of representation. At the same time, the trajectories of contemporary art in Tibet and in Mongolia are structurally different. In Tibet, contemporary art developed in a relatively linear way, largely centered in Lhasa, and with the successive generations building on a shared foundations. In the Mongolia, development has been more open and plural. There is no single center. Artists move through different places, practices, and pathways, creating a decentralized and heterogeneous landscape. As new generation emerge and the new creative ecosystem take shape, the future of minority contemporary art remains open. What is clear, however, is that the places we didn't look from are not the marginal to contemporary art history. They are generative sites where alternative histories, identities, and artistic possibilities continues to be articulated and reimagined. Having reached to the conclusion of this research, I would like to end not with another argument, but with an invitation. Looking from elsewhere together is not only the title of this presentation, but also a way of positioning ourselves. It suggests a shared act of looking. Looking from places are often overlooked, from perspectives are not always centered, and by doing so, side by side. I hope this research can serve as a starting point for future conversations about how we look, from where we look, and with whom we look together. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I welcome your questions and thoughts.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Huang, and thank you truly for your, original and innovative research.
Thank you.
Now let's invite all the jury members to offer their feedback and comments.
Well, that was really a stupendous amount of research that you've done.
Thank you.
And really, making sense of it through both kind of conceptual frameworks as well as kind of the temporality that unfolds. So it's really, really valuable. So I just had a few kind of thoughts about this. Is that if you say one is the question of the category of the minority, right? So or ethnic minority, because in the kind of, let's say, in the People's Republic of China, as a whole, these communities might be considered ethnic minorities, but they are not minority where they live, right? So, in a sense, how does the question of being kind of, in a sense, framed as a minority work when you're looking really at site-specific practices? Okay, so that's one question. The second would be that I think the amount of work you've done here is phenomenal, and one way to kind of, in a sense, extend this would be to think about kind of, in a sense, bringing the work you've done in relation to the developments that have taken place institutionally. Which, for example, which art schools were there where these artists are trained, right? Or art spaces where they had a chance to kind of, in a sense, make work, or the kind of things they were reading, right? Or the let's say the intellectual as well as artistic kind of, let's say, possibilities available to them. And of course that changes probably very rapidly from the mid 90s to the present. But also I think giving a sense of that might be a way for to ground your story of the artistic developments in a kind of a wider framework, right? Which might bring in kind of the institutional, the infrastructural, the socio-economic kind of aspects of it, yeah. And I would say the third thing you could do is which you've started to do, but you could do more with, is to do really close readings of a few works, right? So, so in other words, reading a few kind of, let's say, exemplary works for what they say about, you know, a relation to land, what they say about Buddhism, what they say about our lineages related to the past, and so that might be a really helpful way for to extend your work and also to make it to make the audiences that will be. I assume this is a book project, or okay. I assume this is a book project, or okay. Yeah. So in the book, you may want to kind of think about these. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very valuable feedback, and I definitely will take into the consideration and your feedback into the future research or the future expansion of the research. And I think also, as you mentioned, it's very important to address, and consider what the minority means in China. I guess is first very obviously it's like we have 56 different like ethnic, let's say ethnic, not minorities, but it's translated as minority 少数民族. But we have different like ethnic origins, and the Han is obviously the biggest. So although that Tibet and Inner Mongolia has a very large land, as you can see in the map, but actually the population of the ethnic origins are very, very small amount. So that's why it's called minorities. Although I didn't like use this that much because this often takes a position as marginal, like oh, they're the minority, but actually from the population rate and also how it translated in the like in Mandarin is called 少数民族, which is minority, ethnic minorities. Yes.
Yeah. So that can mean, I think that can mean two things. One would be the mapping of minorities in kind of official kind of in terms of Chinese kind of mapping of communities and regions. But then if you're saying that even in these regions, the people of this ethnicity are in a minority, then I think that's a separate point, and that needs to be like clearly articulated. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, my turn. Thank you so much, Mei Huang.
Thank you.
I think when we were designing this topic for the open call, we had a very clear reason because, site-specific is such a thing. It's such an important tendency in the practice of contemporary Chinese art, especially in the 90s. And it got reflected in a lot of M+ collection works, such as, Wang Gongxing, Zhou Tihai, Ying Xiuzhen's works. So we feel definitely this is an important topic to be explored further. So we actually felt very refreshed when we received so many proposals. But so yours talking about how to give a focal point to the ethnical minority artists practice, which actually very helpful to supplement our institutional work, as we might be very interested in this topic, but we rarely have capacity to really look into this. So that's also the purpose of this program, this fellowship, to bring new knowledge to our institution and also to be presented here publicly. So I would like to express that I'm very impressive for all of your research. And also you have always been very well prepared from your abstract submission and your interview, as well as the presentation you just given. It definitely showed a good articulation and strong argument. So I'm also impressed that, just also to echo to Professor Daddy's comments just now, I feel, at minority, it's a comparative conception. When there's a majority, there's minority.
It's a relational term.
Definitely,
Right? Yeah.
definitely. So I'm also feel impressed that you bring comparative perspective to your research, not just the ethnical minorities artists practice with the Han artist practice, but also between Inner Mongolia and Tibetan artists practice. So I think you did contribute to kind of rebuilding and reclaiming the autonomy of their practice, since historically those ethnical areas were always serving as a place for Han artists to look into, to go to, and also to depict them as their objectives. So I think you totally provided a very refreshing and very innovative perspective. And I know we did a lot of discussions and exchanges on your research topic. And a few following up questions might be that something we also briefly discussed before when you're talking about individual case studies. I hope you can bring more of your own analysis, visual analysis into your final essays. Of course, the interviews and what the artists presented were important, but your own opinion and viewpoint are also equally important to unpack their meanings and concepts. This is one thing. And another thing I feel very interesting is actually what was the visual resources of those artists, especially when you're presenting Ider's installation that he did in 1988, and he incorporated a TV monitor in it. We all know that, is it in 89 or 88? 89.
89-ish,
89.
like
Yes,
continuously,
yes.
yes.
But we all know that in 1988, artist Zhang Peili created the so-called first video work in China. So I'm very curious, is there any relationship, or whether the artists, the Tibetan artists, either know about the practice that Han artists did at the same time, almost the same time. And another thing I'm thinking of is I feel impressed that you traverse very confidently between two timelines, the Inner Mongolia ones and also the Tibetan ones. But it seems to me they are all in parallel. So I'm wondering whether there's an intersection in between. And I hope if you have capacity, I hope you can also unpack further in your final essay.
Oh.
That's my comment.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. And definitely, I also want to thank the M+HK fellowship team, the support to my research, because we always have the the updates. We always have the always reporting the research period and the process. And I have received a lot of good feedback from everyone, and that's definitely upgrade or really increase the research quality of this stage as well. So I also want to thank you, and it's a really great learning process, and I have really learned a lot from this. So yeah, and then the second of all, I think what you said is really the key of the research, because in the Mongolia and the Tibet contemporary art, as we present in this presentation, and not in the isolation, because they always get affected or influenced by the central planned artworks, contemporary artworks, or the global stage as well. So they never develop like a closer door. They always had connections, perhaps friendships with other artists, globally or nationally. So they're not isolated. And as your question of Ider's work, and actually I had a chance just ask him, and he said he didn't particularly see Zhang Peili's work as a reference, but definitely the work from Beijing artist group, especially because Inner Mongolia is very close to Beijing, so the art practices in Beijing at that time definitely give him some inspirational or a spark in his creation, but maybe not like a particular artist. And what the third question is? The intersection, yes. The intersection is very interesting. I would like to share an experience. I went to Huhot. At the very beginning, I just feel like perhaps the contemporary part, the artists perhaps have some interactions, because actually they know each other quite well, and they organize the exhibitions together. And sometimes they told me, I make a call for one artist, and I talk, for example, in the Mongolian artists calling Tibetan artists to get some feedback from their work. So they have certain friendship that's from art field. But historically, when I went to Huhot, I have seen a temple like Dazhao Temple, which is exactly the same name in Lhasa, also in Huhot. And when you enter, you can see the Tibetan letters also in the temple. And that's something I have discovered from my field trip. And I found it's very inspirational, because I didn't know that it would existed before, or it's not written like in the book. So that's something surprise. But I think it's not as parallel as we saying. There's a lot of connections, not only between two regions, but also it's a very complicated, intertwined web here, not just nationally, but internationally.
Yeah, so giving a sense of that, in your, as you develop this project, would be really valuable. But even things like, the infrastructure changes that are coming in, or the changes in the educational system that is coming in, that is maybe rethinking how minorities see themselves, things like that. I think so. How do artists get formed? In other words, that's a question. I mean, you don't want to just have them just emerge out of nowhere, right? So they emerge from somewhere, from a certain training, a certain fashioning, a certain friendships. Yeah. So tell us more about that, okay?
Yeah, in the future, yes, definitely. Yeah. Because I can talk non-stop hours, and it's Friday night, so yeah. Hi, Rosso.
Yes, so coming in from, hi.
Hi.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating and very rich. I think we all learned a lot. And I think, as Mo said, for M+, it's incredibly important to really broaden our understanding of what Chinese contemporary art is and can be. I mean, what does that actually mean? And how to decenter. I think the focus on individual practices and specific works was very useful. And I think, again, to echo what the others have said, to go deeper would be really valuable as well. I mean, I was particularly interested in your focus on site specificity. Obviously, that was the theme that you were asked to work with this fellowship, but also the fact that it provides a really important framework for thinking about place and thinking about location and territory, all of which are very significant in these regions. And I think it would be interesting to know more about where those artists are drawing from. I mean, I also have the same question as Professor Dadi about the institutional frameworks, the schools, the information that artists were drawing on, the networks that they were working with, the other artists they were talking to or looking at that informed their work, but also what they were perhaps drawing on culturally as well. I mean, are there specific ritual practices or, connections to land that come out of being, from those places, and how does that infuse those particular practices, and how that these particular forms of work are in opposition or in response to maybe the more mainstream forms of art making in those places, whether it be, Tanka painting or so on. So I'd be sort of interested to see where they sit in relation to all of those different kinds of forces and trajectories. And I think your comparative was also extremely useful, and I think there's certainly more scope there as well in terms of thinking about how they were working in relation to each other, but also, within wider China, and the kinds of moments that were shared perhaps across different parts of the country, such as the end of the Cultural Revolution, and how information was coming in, and then how that filtered through and impacted different places at different times. And of course, just from the Rauschenberg show that we have on at the moment. I mean, it was an opportunity for us to show or to acquire our first work from Tibet, the Nortse and Liu Zhouquan work, which, Nortse, of course, worked with Rauschenberg on his exhibition. So I was sort of interested in the turn that led to artists working in this mode, in the 90s or late 80s, and what were some of the triggers that moved their practices away from maybe more, other kinds of art making. So they're just a few thoughts.
Thank you. And I definitely think that's a very, I don't know, it's a very surprising, nice coincidence, because we actually went to see the exhibitions of Nortse, in relation that he was influenced. He was telling in the video that he was influenced by the artist, and how he created using his own, imagination that related with other artists' work. And all this exhibition is actually parallel, very good timing that we can, bring this together, because actually it was also, it's kind of in conversation. And I didn't know, Nortse's work at the very beginning was going to be in the show, and it was actually, it's a coincidence, a very nice coincidence. It's like then when I found out, when I see the exhibition, or when the team told me, and I was really positively surprised, and I think this is very good, because it's in the other way actually reflect what I have researched, and also in the way that the exhibition has presented. It's like two lines has crossed somehow. And also, I think your comments are really important as well. And I think in the article, I will look more in depth into the points that you suggested. And I think that can make a better, or the article that, richer and more complicated, but richer and interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks to all the jury members' valuable feedback. And now let's open the floor to all the audience joined us tonight for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, just raise your hands, or staff will pass you the microphone. And we have a lady in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting talk. I learned a lot. I was just wondering about, this is not within your research, but with the country of Mongolia itself, its sovereign country. I'm interested in what kind of site-specific art they have. I know you're not doing that, but I think it would be interesting to look at that vis-a-vis the Inner Mongolia one, and see how the narrative is different, because I'm sure they would be doing similar things maybe. I'm not sure. Can you kind of just even from what your just sort of general observations about that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a very nice connection actually. And in fact, personally, although it's not the part of this research, but I also know many artists that working in Mongolia and actually many artists in Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, they know each other very well, and they definitely making works very well as well. You know, with perhaps some outdoor in the grassland, like more in terms of the nature in relation, some in urban cities in terms of globalization, but of course in the very different context, but definitely in relations because they both speak the same language. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this fascinating talk.
Thank
You
you.
draw a very nice productive parallel between Tibet and Mongolia to consider site specificity. I think basically right now, based on your presentation, you have already demonstrated the parallel in association with the site in relation to identity, relation to locality. However, I think, in the further research, the notion of minor could be addressed in terms of in what ways minor could be related to site specificity. Following the comments from, Professor Dadi about minority compared with minority, potentially the notion of minor could be investigated. Minor China is a very big trend, big term in art history in recent years. Minor is more about relations, traversing major and minor. So that could be also related to your arguments. These artists are not in isolation. They are making connections with artists in Beijing, in Hangzhou, in Shanghai. So that might be something for you to further investigate. What is minor in relation to site specificity? As you mentioned, for example, in Tibet, the development could be more linear. By contrast, in Mongolia, the development could be more plural. How that will be related to the notion of minor and then site specificity. And I really like that part about, the keepers of waters. I guess in your final paper, you definitely, will write about, that project. Initially, the activist group established in Sichuan in 1991. And then in 1996, there was a big artistic event in Tibet, including artists from the local context and some big names, in contemporary Chinese art scene like Song Dongyin, Xiu Zhen. I think that's also something about relations. Minor is about relations rather than defining minority.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a very interesting point I definitely take into consideration. But the other thing is what I want to address is not really, I like it started where we are looking from. I don't, particularly want to address so much about minority because I want to take the position that we are sitting at their side. If we enter this minority side, we can actually enter a lot deeper and there are so many different theories about it. But what I want to address really here in this research is actually we look like, for example, we are looking from, just example, grassland or highland. From there, like, imagining the geographical or the positioning or the time and the land at the site, the space, we look from there to outside, project outside, not where as audience or we are looking away from a distance, like we are say, okay, this, they're the frontiers regions, they're, let's say, minority regions, but looking from their perspective to look the world. So that is also the point that I want to address here. Not so many about minorities. This, although I use many times, but it's because of the the names like 少数民族 using this. But what I really want to address is from their perspective, from the grassland, from the highland, and looking outside. Not as we always look like, we're here, so we look around, we look from distance, and we perhaps, of course, not judgmental, but we always look as outsider. We never truly been there, experience their cultures. That is also what I think that is this research told me, the field research. When you went there, when you in the city, when you talk with people, when you eat their food, when you listen the stories of the artists, when you see their cultures, and you will really feel you are part of it. You don't really feel the concept of the minority anymore. You really feel like you should be there and using their perspective to project outside. And that's what is another important perspective I want to address in this presentation.
To add to your point, which is that I think what you're suggesting is that the minor or minority can be a theoretically productive term, and there's a lot of work in comparative literature on this. So there's a book by Deleuze called Kafka Towards a Minor Literature. That might be a good place to begin, because what really is minor and what is major. The other thing I think is scale, right? Because when you go to the Sikh collection, you see all the works that are really very large scale, right? And because perhaps the artists in Beijing and Shanghai had the resources to make kind of works of that scale. But then when you see the works in from Lhasa or Inner Mongolia, they're comparatively more modest, right? So that's not necessary. In other words, think about that as well. Think about what scale means, and whether that's an enabling, whether larger is not necessarily, do you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a way to think about also like ecology, about kind of the relation of the human to the artwork, all of those things. And I think you could do a lot more enabling and productive way to kind of to develop your project.
I saw the project, the future postdoc projects coming.
Andy Tam from normal Beijing and Hong Kong practice you. I would like to thank you for your sharing about some alternative study about the contemporary art. I will ask any challenges for your research. For example, how the artists to do the documentation or how to contextualize their work. Because I think this is the primary sources you need to deal with. Do you have any difficulty when you only have the picture? And I think since 1990s, we don't have a very common for video, not like Jianpu Li. We have a big video to see the site and see the artwork. So what are the challenges for your study? Because we don't have a lot of the theories, written word for the Mongolia and Tibet. And probably, I think you use a lot of Western theories or culture theory in your study. But I think it's a total different because we have a different land. So can you share your challenges work? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're asking about two questions. First, I answer the first one. And I think you're right, because when you research it, it definitely feel a lot of boundaries. First, geographically, they're very far away. And also, we have the language barrier as well. Some of them perhaps not speaking Mandarin well, not sharing the common language, and also the culture, and also the terms of trust, you work together. And this project is actually it's kind of extension of my PhD research. So I have been working with these artists and these theme for more than 5 or 6 years. So it takes like a bit to build on the trust, to to talk them, not just like a formal interviews like, oh, I interview you. It's like friend chatting about building on the trust, and then share the personal archives and the first-hand knowledges, then interpret it. And the second you said about Swadho and so on, and I feel the same, because when you look at the literature reviews or the series, it's very hard to find the literary review based on this, like specifically talking this. So sometimes you have to improvise. For example, I use this as a methodology, like a foundation to build on, but then you have to like combine your personal experience with the artist interviews, and as the methodology I showed, to create something unique or special for this circumstance. Yeah, I hope you you answered the questions, and yeah, but thank you for this. I really appreciate.
More of a comment somehow. Maybe you're not aware, but many of these artists studied in the academy in China. Gade studied at CAFA with Pili, in fact. They were friends, and they're still friends today. Some of these artists study outside, at least in Oslo, for example. Tashi has a PhD from Oxford University, so from Trondheim University, sorry. And many of these artists have themselves been teaching at Tibet University, at the academy in Lhasa, and nurturing the younger generation. Benjamin is one of them, for example, wonderful artist who is still today teaching. Gade stopped teaching, Tashi has stopped, but many of them so they were not really, and this is part of what happened in Tibet since early 80s, that a little bit later than the rest of China, Tibet opened up. Tibet was basically impossible to travel to Tibet until 82, 83. And then suddenly it opened up. And so this is part of really an incredible changes that have gone through in Tibet in the last 40 years, and some for the better, some for the worse, but everywhere is the same, I think, in that sense. And so they were not working in isolation. Some of these artists were in New York in the early 2000s. There was exhibitions there. There's been exhibition in museums in America since then. So it's, it's fantastic work you're doing, because you're focusing on something that has been very important and not so well researched, especially the site-specific part of these, the nature of these artists, which started, as you were showing, with Nortse doing this performance. And the other thing I want to say is that it's true that the work sometimes are in minor scale, but they also have done very, very large work, which have been shown in Beijing by Li Shanting, The Scorching Sun of Tibet, wonderful exhibition 2011, if I remember well. And both Gade and Nortz and other artists did really kind of massive installation. So given the chance, they will do big works as well. In fact, some of them were shown at Art Basel Hong Kong as well many years back. So just a comment on that. But it's great to hear your research. It's fantastic, really. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have a few things to add because I have already met the true professional here in Tibet. But yeah, I also, learn a lot from the catalogs that Rosie has produced. And it's definitely, when I talk to artists, they also mention that you went there. And, I went to the restaurant, you went with them as well. Yeah, so yeah, it was a good choice, yes. Mm-hmm. Nice.
So I guess our time is up, and just thanks everyone, and thanks Dr. Huang Mei for your amazing talk.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
coming to
everyone
M+
for coming.
on the
Thank
Friday
you.
night. Thank you.
Thank you.